Okay, let's get this started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ryan Douglas. I work as an advisor at the intersection of capital and cultivation. And today we're going to be exploring greenhouses as a potential tool for minimizing dependence on grants. So I'm going to try to keep this to about 30 minutes. I welcome your questions. Please go ahead and put those in the chat or the comment area, whatever works. And rather than handle those questions live, I'm going to review those after we finish today, and then I'll send out kind of a general answer sheet along with a link to this webinar recording. So, why are we talking about this? Over the last year or so, I've had a number of discussions with executive directors of nonprofit organizations and fundraisers for those nonprofit organizations. And I noticed some recurring themes, some recurring concerns when I was speaking to those individuals. One of those, obviously, is that with the current administration, federal funds that over the past several years had been going towards some of these nonprofits, those programs, those funds are no longer available. So that's forced organizations to kind of get creative and pursue kind of alternative sources of funding to keep their programs active. I've also heard that there can be a reluctance from funders to continue funding the same program year after year after year, even if it's achieving the organization's objectives, even if they're doing a great job. It sounds like oftentimes foundations are looking for new initiatives, new programs, which kind of leaves the nonprofit scrambling to either kind of create new programs to kind of chase the new grants, which maybe isn't the best strategy, or simply to close those programs down. So look, my background is in greenhouses and commercial cultivation, and I'm aware of a number of nonprofit groups that are using greenhouses as revenue generators. So I thought it was kind of a timely topic and really worth looking at a couple of different case studies and talk at a very high level to see where these make sense and where they don't. So really the basic idea is that the organization is funding a project once, which is the greenhouse. That greenhouse generates revenue to cover its own operating expenses. And then the net profit from that operation goes to the organization, thereby not eliminating the need for grants, but certainly decreasing the dependence and providing something a little bit more stable year after year after year. So before we get into it, I just want to kind of start off with this one thought, kind of this one key for success, regardless of the type of greenhouse operation we're talking about. So in my experience, most greenhouses don't fail because of funding, right? They fail because the operating model was never clearly defined. So you can have something that's successful, something that's generating revenue, but it never becomes financially sustainable. So the question isn't, can we build a greenhouse? Should we build a greenhouse? Really, the question is, can this become a reliable, repeatable source of revenue that actually reduces dependence on grants? So I think the best way to really understand this from a high level is to look at a number of different case studies, and we're going to jump into that right now. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. And the very first case study we're going to be looking at is a company called CT Food for Thought, based out of Torrington, Connecticut. And they are a division of the nonprofit New Opportunities Incorporated. So what we're looking at here is a typical hydroponic production greenhouse. What you're seeing here, essentially kind of mid-level is plant production. Kind of on the upper level, you've got a couple of things going on. We've got supplementary lights. These folks are based out of Connecticut, so if you know anything about the Northeast, we've got pretty long winters and short days. So depending on the crop you're growing, typically you want to add some kind of supplemental lighting. So that's pretty standard practice in the industry. And then if you look just above those lights, what is bunched up there is actually a greenhouse screen or greenhouse curtain, and they serve two purposes. So in the winter, these curtains are completely closed. And what that does is help to retain heat inside the greenhouse overnight. It's a little bit more energy efficient. And then they can actually be used in the summertime as well, kind of if they're kind of closed halfway to provide shading and essentially cool the greenhouse down. So this is a very kind of standard greenhouse for hydroponic food production. It's not over-engineered. There's probably hundreds of these kinds of greenhouses in the US and likely thousands across the world. So it's nothing, groundbreaking. It's not over-engineered. It's not cutting edge. It's pretty straightforward and proven, which is a good thing for the kind of projects that we're talking about, right? We're really not looking for surprises here. We're looking for proven models, almost boring. And believe me, with this kind of a project, boring is a good thing. So what we're looking at here is the product, what they're growing in the greenhouse. So they've selected lettuce, so one crop, but probably just based on this photograph, maybe 5 or 6 different varieties. They're likely selling either, I mean, if you think about it, you go to a grocery store, there's only a couple different ways you buy lettuce, either kind of individual kind of leaf lettuce or mixed in a bag with different kinds of varieties or kind of the whole head lettuce. Without knowing the details, my guess is they're probably selling either one or all of those different formats, but at its core, it's lettuce. So here's a bit of a different angle. As I mentioned, this is a hydroponic greenhouse. And for anyone that doesn't know, hydroponics is simply a way of growing plants without using soil. And so if you look closely here, what you've got are these kind of tubular, kind of plastic gutters. And the tomato plants are set inside these holes inside those plastic gutters. And at the end, you can see these kind of spaghetti tubes. And what those do is deliver water and nutrient solution into those gutters. Inside are the bare roots of the lettuce plant. And so there's a constant flow of nutrient solution. It's probably a quarter of an inch deep that those roots are constantly sitting in. So it's oxygenated, the pH is adjusted, it's just the right amount of solution. It's pumped in through one end. That growing platform is slightly pitched, so it drains to the other end. That water is captured. It's brought to a tank where it's filtered. The pH is adjusted if necessary. There's nutrients that are adjusted or added if necessary, and then it's sent back out to the plants again. So it's a recirculating system. It's very common and is one of really the standard practices for growing lettuce on a commercial scale today. So it's worth mentioning, I've spent almost 30 years in commercial horticulture. Probably 20 years ago, I was a grower inside of a hydroponic lettuce range that looked almost identical to this. And so that's worth noting because over the last couple of decades, when you think about, hundreds of different lettuce growing operations of all the different kind of trials and tribulations and in production methods they've experimented with, we've landed as an industry on this as really the safest, straightforward, least inexpensive, most reliable method of growing lettuce. And it hasn't changed in decades. And neither has that greenhouse. So when I mentioned 20 years ago working in a greenhouse growing lettuce, it was almost this identical greenhouse. So we've established as an industry what makes sense for a greenhouse and what makes sense for a plant production system. And these folks in Connecticut are doing exactly that. So, based on their literature and information I read about the company, they have two 15,000 square foot greenhouses. So what we're looking at here is likely one of those. We've got 3 bays in this greenhouse. So if you look at the top of the greenhouse, you've got kind of where the roof comes to a peak. Where that runs lengthwise there, that's what we would call a bay. So it looks like 3 bays. If that's 15,000 square feet, about 5,000 square feet per bay. In the very left-hand corner of the photograph, you see a building, which is likely the the kind of post-harvest packaging. Likely there's some coolers in there that's for shipping and receiving. So you've got kind of a post-harvest area. And if they have two facilities, my guess would be just on the other side of that post-harvest building are the other greenhouses. And so again, very standard, straightforward, proven model, almost boring, which again is a beautiful thing when we're talking about launching projects that we really need to be successful the first time around. So I think so far an excellent example of a greenhouse being used as a uh, social enterprise. So we mentioned, there's only a couple different ways that we buy lettuce, and here's just a photograph I found of one of the ways they package their product. So it looks like some loose leaf romaine lettuce, and you can see their label there. If you look at the numbers, so as I mentioned, all combined, they've got 30,000 square feet of greenhouse. They're producing about 12,000 heads of lettuce a week, which is just over 600,000 heads of lettuce in a year. And digging into their annual report, actually through the publicly available 990, what I was able to find is that for their most recent fiscal year, they generated just over $380,000 in revenue. So what we do know is how much the greenhouse generated. What we don't know is how much of that was actually profit and how much went to covering the operational costs. Unfortunately, the 990s and the annual reports give some insight into, where the money is coming from for a given organization, but unless you have, kind of inside information, we really have no idea to determine if this is, incredibly profitable or just barely profitable or, running at a deficit. So a little bit later in the presentation, I'll provide some kind of numbers where we could speculate based on these numbers what I think they would likely be netting in terms of profit. But for right now, we don't know. But based on everything we've seen in these last few photographs, they've got all the ingredients for success. And when I was researching for this presentation, I came across an article from last fall where they actually received $1 million in grant money to expand the project. So not $1 million to cover operating expenses of the existing project, but it had to have been successful enough to warrant actually expanding and doing more of what's already working. So kudos to them. Okay, so case study number 2. This is a little bit different. This organization is called Peckham Incorporated. I believe the headquarters are based out of Lansing, Michigan, but the facility I'll be speaking about here over the next few minutes is based out of Caledonia, Michigan. So, similar to the first case study, this is also a commercial scale lettuce, hydroponic lettuce production facility. But the difference, rather than kind of designing and building and launching the greenhouse operation, what they did was acquired an existing operation. So from the day from the day the deal was done, the acquisition was final, they were in possession of a cash flowing business, if not from the first day, certainly the first week. So, I mean, that there, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit organization, really eliminates, 80% of the risk for any kind of a greenhouse startup because you're already purchasing something that's literally like a turnkey plug and play opportunity. So when you think about one of the benefits of buying instead of starting is that you have a lot of the people and processes already in place. You don't have to start from scratch, and it really reduces, almost eliminates the learning curve. And if you think, any time in business when one business is acquired by another business, oftentimes you hear about agreements where management or ownership agrees to stay on or consult for a period of time to kind of ensure a seamless transaction. Even if that's not the case, oftentimes what I found is that there's what I would call legacy employees. So people that worked for the greenhouse under the prior ownership, and they want to continue working there, And the benefit is that these folks don't need, there's no orientation, there's no training. I mean, they've got, it's like muscle memory. They already know how the operation works, how the greenhouse works, all the processes, how everything works. So it's really, it's a very uh, interesting angle in terms of starting a greenhouse social enterprise. And so, like I mentioned, it's really plug and play in terms of systems and processes already in place. So here on the left, this is likely the post-harvest or packaging area, which was that building. In the first example, was the building between the two greenhouses. But this is where the product is brought to be either cut or washed or packaged or weighed, whatever that process is. And on the right, again, it's a hydroponic system, a little bit different than the case study we were looking at in Connecticut. So instead of having plants inside of these plastic tubular troughs, these lettuce plants are actually in rafts and they float in a shallow pool of oxygenated, pH adjusted nutrient solution. So if you can imagine, if you picked up that tray of lettuce, you've got a lot of these the white roots of the lettuce plant would be dangling down into the solution. So different kind of hydroponic, but again, really today the most efficient and common method for commercial production of lettuce is hydroponic. A couple of different ways to do that, but again, it's working, it's successful, and it's a very common way to grow lettuce. So now when we look at the numbers, if you were to research this organization, it's interesting. So Peckham Incorporated actually has 5 or 6 social enterprise businesses totally unrelated to each other. But it seems like that's part of their mode of operation, and this one just happens to be a greenhouse lettuce production facility. So sometimes it's referred to as Revolution Farms. That was the name of the company when they acquired it. Sometimes it's referred to as Peckham Farms. But whatever they call it, this is the facility they're referring to. And based on my research, it was acquired at the beginning of last year. So it's a 2.5 acre greenhouse, and they had another acre attached to those greenhouses for, again, post-harvest production, processing, storage, and shipping. So based on their numbers, it's producing about 1.5 million pounds of lettuce per year. And on their website, you can see their most recent annual report, and they're saying that the greenhouse generated $1.7 million in revenue for the last fiscal year. So again, no insight into how much of that is operating cost, how much is net profit. But again, unless we have insight into kind of privileged information, we don't have access to those numbers. So now for the third case study, I want to take a little bit more time with this because I think it's important. I mean, I'm a greenhouse guy, but I'm not selling greenhouses or the idea of greenhouses as really a silver bullet, right? In the best case scenarios, it's a modest, reliable income stream, and that's when it works. And it doesn't work for everyone, and I don't think it's an appropriate option or solution for. And so I think it's important for us to look at case studies that were not successful so that we can learn from those. And should we kind of move forward in this direction in the future, be sure not to repeat some of these mistakes. So Recovery Park is the name of the nonprofit organization based out of Detroit. So if you look in the picture there, you've got the buildings of Detroit in the background. And in the front, you've got what's, I think it's about 8 kind of hoop house greenhouses for this project. And let's see, incorporated in 2016, and they received $1.4 million in grants for this greenhouse project. And so it was established, really the focus of the organization was to provide jobs for people with employment barriers and produce fresh, locally grown produce to the Detroit food system. So that's kind of the intent. And so here we have a picture inside one of these greenhouses. You've got a couple of maybe 10 different kinds of crops being grown in this greenhouse. That's because the project was initially designed as a pilot program. So they wanted to do some research in terms of identifying what kind of demand there is for different kind of products, and then kind of trialing the best way to grow those products, and then design another greenhouse, a different structure, kind of a phase two of an acre and a half, a very sophisticated glass greenhouse to go ahead and move forward on that project. So what we have here, everything looks good. You've got a couple people working in the greenhouse. You've got rows of different kinds of crops that are being grown out in a trial. So far, so good. Now, the problem arises a couple years after launching this program. The Detroit Metro Times returned to Recovery Park to see how things were going. And this is what they found. So, definitely not a success. So the question is, what happened here? Why did this project go astray? And so I've got a couple opinions about this, and I think the first is really the model that was originally designed for this project. It was a pilot program. So, like I said, the goal was to grow a number of different kinds of crops, see what there was a demand for in the Detroit area, then determine the best way to grow those crops, and then, based on all that research, finally build the real thing, an acre and a half glass greenhouse to go ahead and do the thing. So here's my concern. The first is they didn't have a defined crop strategy. So in my opinion, I think grant funds should be used to meet proven market demand and not experiment, right? So focusing on known high demand crops really helps to ensure kind of the sustainability and impact of the project. So we already know what crops are in demand, right? We're buying fruits and vegetables, every week at the grocery store. So rather than try to discover something that's not quite in demand, what we should do is focus on what is in demand and how can we compete and kind of gain some of that shelf space for us, right? So we're competing on quality, competing on consistency, competing on price. I mean, there's a different kind of a project that's not appropriate for a greenhouse social venture, a different kind of project where it's really more of discovering kind of specialty crops, maybe things that aren't quite part of the American palate yet. Discovering these crops, kind of finding out how to grow them, looking at different commercialization programs so we can create markets either locally or for export. So that's very valid. And as a grower, as a plant person, it's fascinating. I think it has a critical part in the future of kind of our food ecosystem. But it's essentially an R&D project. And the result of a lot of R&D projects is that more R&D is needed. So it's kind of it's if that was the business venture itself, it's very high risk. And although valid by itself, not appropriate for what we're doing here, which is identifying the market, building the greenhouse, growing the produce, and selling it at a profit. So I think that using Foundation's money to kind of launch kind of a pilot program or research program in this sense really isn't the most appropriate use of that money. So the second point is no defined crop production method. So if you do any research on kind of what the plan was, let me go back to this photo here. They wanted to find, so once they identify what it is they're going to grow, then they would identify the best way to grow that in this setting. Now, the problem is, as you can see, all these crops are being grown in the soil, on the ground, in these greenhouses. But the goal after the pilot program was to build something completely different, a very high-tech glass greenhouse, which most likely would be hydroponically grown. And as we saw in the previous case studies, these are on platforms, right, in a hydroponic system. So any kind of learning that was acquired through this pilot program is totally irrelevant once they go to a new greenhouse. The third point is no commercially viable structure. So I believe it was a waste of funders' money to build these kind of temporary structures, which if the whole program came together, they would not be using moving on anyway. But it's really a very short time use because if you think about this, so they're in Detroit, Michigan. If you know anything about Midwest winters, they're very intense. Um, and the summers are equally as extreme, right? And so this structure is not built for either one of those. So it's literally just a plastic shell around the frame, which is not at all very energy efficient. Even if you ran heat in this throughout the winter, it's literally like throwing money out the window because it's just not very energy efficient. And on the flip side, you really couldn't grow in there in the summer because it's not built for summer production. More than half of the top part of that structure is completely closed. There's no ventilation. Even there's a vent on the end there. Even if you had kind of extraction fans moving air, you're just blowing around really hot air. If you've ever walked into like a garden center in the summer and walked inside an empty greenhouse, it's really hot, right? Now just imagine what a plant of lettuce would feel like. So at the most, these structures are really kind of for growing in the shoulder seasons. So kind of like in the spring where you can get a jump start where it's too cold outside, but if you have a protected structure, you can kind of lengthen the growing season that way. Or in the fall, it allows you to kind of push the growing season into the early winter where otherwise you couldn't do it outdoors. But if you think of part of a pilot project would be to establish relationships with a customer, whether it's a food distributor or a grocery store. And we do that by showing that we can consistently deliver a certain product of a certain quality, week after week after week. But this structure is simply not built to support that kind of a program. So for a number of different reasons, I think that project stalled. So here's what I think would have been a much more appropriate avenue to approach, and that would be what I would call a feasibility study. And I think that any foundation, any grantor that's interested in this kind of world of greenhouse production, of greenhouse social enterprises, would be thrilled to fund a feasibility study at a fraction of the cost of what was spent on this project here. And so when you really think through a feasibility study, you could tick all these boxes here, right? So that would involve going to either food distributors or grocery stores, speaking with the buyers and seeing, what kind of a demand do you have that isn't being met consistently? Or if you're meeting that demand, what kind of challenges or struggles are you having with your current providers? And so kind of identify the crop that makes the most sense and identify how you're going to kind of gain shelf space by competing on quality, on consistency, on price, on whatever it is you identify in that study. So feasibility study, I think, is a much more appropriate way to go after what these folks were doing, and it could be done for a fraction of the cost of what this program eventually costed, which was $1.4 million. And in the end, this is what they got for it. And so look, just circling back to the very first case study, this is why I think these folks did it right. They didn't look for what kind of crops potentially there could be a market for. They went after a market where there's obviously a lot of demand, right? So in the US, we're obsessed with lettuce. We love lettuce. And so they targeted that market. In terms of how to grow, they didn't need money to find out the best way to grow. They didn't try reinventing the wheel, right? They went after, like I said, a way that I was growing 20 years ago, hydroponic lettuce, and they instituted something that's proven, well-known, low risk, almost boring, perfect. And the same thing with the greenhouse, right? They didn't build a trial greenhouse to give it a shot and then later look for money to build the real one, right? They built the thing from the get-go. So let's look at the numbers. In my experience, I think you really need a minimum of 2 acres for a successful commercial greenhouse facility. And the reason is the way we establish really a market presence is by continually having our product on the shelf 52 weeks of the year. And so if you take a small greenhouse and you divide that into 52 sections, if you're only producing a couple of heads of lettuce or a few vegetables, it's really difficult to really establish any kind of profitable business that way. So there are economies of scale. And in my opinion, in my experience, I really think we need to look at a minimum of 2 acres of greenhouse. And that's the case studies we looked at were a little bit less and a little bit more. So about 2 acres of greenhouse. And for this example, Of course, there's a lot of different crops to grow, but let's just kind of keep one consistent line across the board, which is lettuce. So let's look at a 2-acre lettuce greenhouse, hydroponic greenhouse here in the US. The number I use is typically $1 million per acre. So if you think a greenhouse in the Northeast US, they're going to be battling different environmental kind of climate issues than in the Southwest, right? So in the Northeast, you've got kind of dark, cold winters, and in the South West, you're going to be battling, a lot of bright sun, a lot of heat. So different greenhouses for different regions. But just to keep things kind of level, $1 million per acre is a pretty safe number to work with. In terms of lettuce production, the rule of thumb is about $500,000 in revenue per acre per year. So $500,000 per acre, we're looking at a 2-acre lettuce greenhouse. That's $1 million in gross revenue per year. Now, what we weren't able to determine from the other case studies is really how much of that is net profit. And so the numbers we want to look at really in the very, very low end, you're looking at single digits, like maybe 5%. But more realistically, for well-run professional operations, really it's more like 10 to 15%. So on $1 million of revenue, we're looking at 100 to 150,000 in net profit. And if this is a greenhouse social enterprise, that's literally 6 figures in a profit that's going to the organization, the nonprofit organization, every year after year after year after year, hopefully reducing dependence on grants. So just a couple of key considerations before we finish up today. I know that $2 or $3 or $4 million is a huge number. Believe me, that's not lost on me. But what we need to remember is that it's very seldom that projects like this are funded by just one foundation, right? Typically, they're assembled from a number of different stakeholders. So private foundations, public foundations, corporate foundations, community economic development corporations, even maybe in-kind donations from the manufacturers or suppliers of the horticultural equipment, because that's really good visibility for their brand and their company. So yes, 3 million is a big number, but when you start to kind of chunk that up and break that up between funders, it becomes much more palatable and realistic. The second point is about the labor overhead. So 85% operating cost seems like a big number, and it is. But part of that, really a big chunk of that, is going to be labor. But what we need to remember in these kind of greenhouses is that depending on the organization, the labor isn't just part of the cost here, it's actually part of the mission. So if part of the organization's mission is like workforce training or kind of reentry for people that have kind of barriers to employment, the labor isn't only getting the work done in the greenhouse, it's actually part of the mission as well. And then the third point is really leveraging that greenhouse as a tool. So one, it's reducing dependency on grants by generating revenue and sending profit to the organization. Second, it can be used to accomplish the part of the mission of the organization, things like workforce training or reentry. Third, if the organization, a lot of nonprofits are focused on food security, food resilience, producing locally. When things are grown and harvested and sold within a couple miles of each other, it's very feasible that in the very same day it can be harvested, packaged, and on the grocery shelf in the same day. And then the last point where I think there's a lot of opportunity is education. So it would be very easy to incorporate an educational element into one of these greenhouses without spending hardly anything. I mean, think about middle school, high school, technical schools, public universities, right? Anyone that's interested in kind of the future of farming. Because one thing is for sure is that we're going to continue to have a greater and greater population, but there's not going to be more land to grow these crops on. And so if we focus on kind of hydroponics in the future of farming, anytime you bring a crop that's traditionally grown outdoors, you bring it indoors and grow it hydroponically, you use less water, less fertilizer, less pesticide or no pesticide. And so there's a number of different really educational components that greenhouse could be used kind of as as a tool, really leveraging that as more than just a greenhouse that produces lettuce. So just to kind of end on these notes, I would ask you to remember that a greenhouse really is the tool, but the model determine whether or not it pays for itself. And if the model isn't defined, you're not building revenue, you're building just another funding obligation. So hopefully you were able to stick with me through that presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I mean, this is kind of the world I live in. This is where I tend to spend most of my time, really working with organizations and investors, either before or after these kind of projects launch, to ensure that they deliver what the financial model assumes. So I appreciate your time. I'll follow up with responses to any questions and a link to the recording within 24 hours. So have a great day.